My name is Winona Hatfield, and I was 25 years old when my mother laughed and said I'd never own a house like my sister. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even sound angry. That was the part that made it worse, how easy it was for her to say it, like she was commenting on the weather, like it was already decided. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even flinch the way I usually did. I just smiled. And I know how that sounds, like I was taking it. Like I was admitting she was right. But that smile wasn't surrender. It was a door closing. Let me take you back to where all of this started. Before the Thanksgiving table, before the house, before my mother's laugh became the last sound I ever wanted to chase. I'm the youngest of 2 daughters. My older sister, Victoria, is 3 years older than me. And from the moment I could form memories, I understood I was living inside a comparison I never agreed to. Victoria was everything my mother admired. Beautiful in a polished way. Poised. The kind of girl who knew where to place her hands in photos and how to make adults feel like they were the most interesting person in the room. Teachers loved her. Neighbors bragged about her like she belonged to all of them. She graduated top of her class, went to an Ivy League school on a partial scholarship, and landed a corporate job straight out of college, making more money than anyone in our family had ever admitted out loud. My mother used those facts like scripture. And me? I was the artsy one, the dreamer, the kid who would spend hours drawing in the margins of notebooks while my mother sighed like she was watching a slow disaster unfold. I wanted to study graphic design instead of business. I picked a state school because I actually liked their program, not because it had a famous name. After graduation, I took a job at a small creative agency, making a modest salary. Enough to live, enough to breathe, enough to feel like my life belonged to me. I loved my work. I still do. But in my mother's eyes, love was a weakness. Passion was something you grew out of. Security was the only language she respected. The comparisons started early and never stopped. Why can't you be more like your sister? I heard it so often it became background noise, like the hum of an old refrigerator you don't notice until it shuts off. If Victoria got an A, my B+ was a problem. If Victoria made varsity, my art award was nice, but if Victoria wore a dress and looked effortless, my paint-stained jeans were proof I wasn't trying hard enough. Even compliments came with a blade. "You're creative," my mother would say, and then add, "If only you'd apply it to something useful." Victoria learned quickly that the spotlight belonged to her, and she didn't just stand in it, she guarded it. When she bought her first house at 26 with her lawyer fiancé Brandon, it became the gold standard, the family achievement. The story my mother told at church, at work, to strangers in grocery store lines. "She's building a real life," my mother would say, not like some people who just float. I was 23 at the time, living in a cramped apartment with 2 roommates, juggling student loans and long hours. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I paid my bills. I showed up for myself. I was proud of my independence in a quiet, stubborn way. My mother didn't see independence. She saw delay. She saw failure that hadn't fully ripened yet. Still, every year, I drove back home for Thanksgiving with this ridiculous hope in my chest. Like maybe, just once, I'd sit at that table and feel like I belonged. Last Thanksgiving, I drove 3 hours to my parents' house, telling myself, maybe this year will be different. Maybe my mother would ask about my life without twisting it into a lecture. Maybe my sister would talk to me like a sister instead of a judge. I walked into the house with a pie in my hands and a careful smile on my face, and I could already feel the air, thick with old expectations. Victoria and Brandon arrived in their Mercedes, and the room shifted instantly. My mother's entire posture changed. Her shoulders lifted. Her eyes brightened like she'd been saving her best self for their entrance. "They're here," she said, as if royalty had arrived. Victoria swept in, wearing a tailored sweater that looked expensive without trying. Brandon followed with that confident, lawyerly grin and a bottle of wine like he was offering tribute. The praise started before anyone even sat down. They had just closed on a second property, a vacation home in the mountains. My mother practically glowed as Victoria pulled out her phone. 4 bedrooms, Victoria said, scrolling through pictures. 3 bathrooms, hot tub on the deck. The view is insane. Brandon chuckled. My bonus this year was pretty generous. That's wonderful, sweetheart, my mother gushed. You two are so successful. I'm so proud of you. Everyone leaned in to admire the photos like they were sacred. I sat there eating mashed potatoes, forcing myself to smile, trying to find that clean, uncomplicated happiness you're supposed to feel for your sister. I really was trying. Then my mother turned to me with that look that said she was about to cut me in half and call it concern. Winona, honey, she said sweetly, are you still renting that little place downtown? Yes, Mom, I answered. Same apartment. It's actually really nice. We repainted last month. Victoria laughed like I'd told a joke. You repainted a rental? She said, not even trying to hide her condescension. That's so sad. You know you'll never get that money back, right? I like where I live, I said quietly. But you're still renting, my mother pressed, leaning forward like she was trying to help me see reality. At your age, you should be building equity, investing in property. Victoria's smile sharpened. My father's fork paused midair, then continued like nothing happened. Victoria owned her first home by 26, my mother added. You're 25 now, aren't you? I'll be 26 in January, I said. Exactly my point. My mother shook her head like I was a problem she couldn't solve. You'll never own a house like your sister, not at the rate you're going. The words hung in the air. Poison disguised as prediction. Victoria smirked across the table. An expression I'd seen my entire life. The one that said, she didn't just believe it, she enjoyed it. She'll be broke forever, Mom, Victoria chimed in. That's what happens when you choose passion over practicality. I tried to tell her to go into something more stable, but she wouldn't listen. I looked to my father, just once, like a child still hoping for rescue. He shifted uncomfortably. He stared at his plate. He said nothing. He never defended me. He never told them to stop. He just stayed quiet and let my mother and sister tear me down year after year because silence was easier than conflict. Something inside me cracked, but not the way they expected. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't launch into a speech about my goals or my work or the promotion I was being considered for. I didn't tell them about the freelance projects I'd been doing on the side, the clients who trusted me, the nights I stayed up building something that belonged to me. I just smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. Because in that moment, I realized something so clear, it felt like cold water on my face. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need to prove anything to them. I could live my life for me, and their opinions literally did not matter. You might be right, I said calmly, finishing my potatoes. My mother blinked, surprised I wasn't fighting back. Victoria looked almost disappointed she didn't get a bigger reaction. I stayed for another hour out of habit, out of politeness, out of the last threads of who I used to be. Then I excused myself, claiming I had work the next day. I drove home that night with tears streaming down my face. Not because I was hurt, though I was, but because I was free. Free from chasing a validation that was never coming. Free from shrinking myself into a version my mother could brag about. That Thanksgiving didn't just embarrass me, it woke me up. And the part that still makes my stomach twist, even now, they thought they'd won. They thought they'd put me back in my place. They had no idea that while they were laughing at me, something inside me had quietly stood up, brushed itself off, and decided, never again. The strange thing about hitting emotional rock bottom is how quiet it feels afterward. No dramatic music, no instant transformation, just a heavy stillness, and then space. After Thanksgiving, I didn't announce anything. I didn't post vague quotes. I didn't cut my family off with a speech or a fight. I simply stepped back. I answered texts politely but briefly. I declined invitations citing work. I stopped explaining myself. My mother called it sulking. Victoria told relatives I was being dramatic. I called it survival. For years, I'd been playing it safe. staying in a job that paid the bills, saving responsibly, telling myself that one day, when things were stable enough, I'd take a bigger risk. But that dinner burned something out of me. I realized I'd been living my life like I was waiting for permission, waiting for approval I was never going to get, trying to hit milestones that were never designed for me. What my family didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask, was that I was good at what I did, really good. For 2 years, I'd been freelancing on the side. Logo designs, branding packages, websites for small businesses and startups that didn't have big budgets but had big ideas. I loved working with people who were building something from scratch because that's exactly what I was doing too, but I kept it small, safe. I treated it like a hobby that happened to pay well because part of me was still afraid to fail, afraid to prove my mother right, afraid to step fully into something she'd already dismissed as impractical. That Thanksgiving night changed that. A week later, I made a decision that scared me more than anything I'd ever done. I bet on myself. I registered an LLC, built a professional website instead of a portfolio I kept hidden, raised my rates to actual industry standards instead of apologetic numbers that felt easier to justify. I emailed every contact I'd ever worked with. I joined online communities for founders and creatives. I positioned myself clearly, not as the artsy girl, but as a branding specialist. The response stunned me. Clients didn't disappear when I raised my rates. They respected me more. Within 3 months, my freelance income was higher than my full-time salary. By month 6, I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at my spreadsheets, realizing I could quit my agency job without panicking. So I did. I handed in my resignation with shaking hands and a calm smile. My manager tried to talk me out of it, told me freelancing was risky, unstable. I nodded politely. I'd been living unstable my whole life, just not in ways people recognized. I didn't tell my family any of this. What was the point? My mother would call it a phase. Victoria would call it luck. My father would stay silent. So I kept building in peace. My business grew fast. I hired a virtual assistant, then a junior designer. I developed a niche in branding for tech startups, and word traveled quickly in those circles. My calendar filled up weeks in advance. I started turning clients away. For the first time in my life, I felt something dangerous. Confidence. Not loud confidence, not bragging confidence. The kind that settles into your bones and makes you walk differently. I chose my clients. I set my boundaries. I worked from my apartment in leggings at midnight or from cafes at noon, and every decision felt like it belonged to me. I was making more money than I'd ever imagined. But more importantly, I was happy. 8 months in, my accountant leaned back in his chair during a quarterly meeting and said something that made my heart stutter. "Winona, you're sitting on a significant amount of cash," he said. "Have you thought about investments?" I laughed. "Like what, stocks?" "Eventually. But have you considered real estate?" "Real estate. The thing my mother said I'd never achieve. The thing Victoria used as proof that she'd won." I went home that night and opened my laptop. Not to design, but to research. Neighborhoods, mortgage rates, first-time buyer programs. I read until my eyes burned. A week later, I met a real estate agent named Sarah. Sharp, confident, in her 50s, with the kind of presence that made people listen. She reviewed my financials without blinking. "This is solid," she said. "What are you looking for?" "Something with character," I said without hesitation. "Something that feels like it has a story. I don't want a cookie-cutter house." She smiled slowly. "I think I know exactly what you need." We spent 3 weekends touring properties. Modern lofts downtown, cute bungalows in up-and-coming neighborhoods, even a converted warehouse that felt exciting but empty. Nothing clicked. I started to wonder if this was another dream I'd have to set down carefully. Then Sarah called me on a Tuesday afternoon. "I have something," she said. "It's a bit of a project. Are you open to renovations?" "Depends on the house. Trust me. Can you meet me tomorrow at 10? The next morning, I followed her directions into a neighborhood I'd only ever driven through once or twice. Millbrook Heights. Old money. tree-lined streets. The kind of place my mother used to point at from the car and sigh. As we turned onto Rosewood Avenue, my breath caught. Massive oak trees arched overhead. Every house was different. Porches, turrets, stained glass, gardens that looked curated by time itself. Sarah stopped in front of a pale yellow Victorian with white trim. 3 stories, a wraparound porch, a tower on the left side. Even from the curb, I felt something shift. This one's been on the market 6 weeks, Sarah said. The owner's 93, moving into assisted living. She's rejected 3 offers already. Why? I asked. She wants the right buyer. When we stepped inside, I fell in love instantly. The hardwood floors creaked softly under my feet. Light filtered through stained glass, scattering color across the walls. The kitchen was dated. The bathrooms needed work. Wallpaper peeled in places. But the bones were perfect. High ceilings, crown molding, built-in shelves, a carved fireplace mantel, and the turret, a circular room flooded with light. This, I said quietly, this would be my office. Sarah smiled. Should I arrange a meeting with the owner? Yes, I said without hesitation. Absolutely. 2 days later, I met Eleanor Hartwell in the living room of the house that already felt like mine. She was small, sharp-eyed, and observant. You're young, she said. Why this house? I could have talked about investment value. Instead, I told her the truth. I've spent my whole life feeling like I didn't fit, I said. But this place feels like it's been waiting for someone who understands it. She studied me for a long moment. My husband said something similar, she whispered. 2 weeks later, we closed. When Eleanor pressed the original brass key into my hand, I cried. I didn't tell my family. I renovated quietly, carefully, restoring instead of erasing. 4 months later, the house was finished. Magnificent. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had arrived exactly where I was supposed to be. What I didn't know yet was how quickly the silence would shatter. I moved into the house on a Saturday morning with nothing but my car, a few boxes, and a quiet certainty that this place was mine. Not just legally, emotionally, spiritually. Millbrook Heights felt different when you lived inside it. Mornings came softly there. Sunlight filtered through oak leaves and stained glass, painting the walls in gold and blue. Neighbors waved without prying. The air itself felt settled, like it had seen generations pass and decided to keep their secrets. The turret became my office, exactly the way I'd imagined. Built-in bookshelves curved along the walls, a window seat overlooked the garden. I worked there for hours, sometimes forgetting to eat, sometimes stopping just to breathe and remind myself that this wasn't a dream. I still hadn't told my family. Part of me wanted that moment where my mother's eyes widened, where Victoria's smirk disappeared. I wanted to say, "You were wrong." I wanted to watch it land. But a bigger part of me knew something else. If I showed them, I'd be handing them access to my space, my peace, my accomplishment. And they hadn't earned that. 2 weeks after I moved in, my phone rang while I was reviewing a branding proposal at my desk. Mom. I stared at the screen until it stopped vibrating. Then it rang again. I answered. Hello? Her voice was clipped, tight, already irritated. I'm calling because Victoria told me you've been telling people you bought a house. My stomach dropped. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew exactly where this was going. It's not a joke, I said evenly. Silence. Where? She finally asked. And how? Last I checked, you were barely making ends meet with your little art projects. There it was. I bought a house, I repeated. It's in Millbrook Heights. The silence this time was longer. That's impossible, she said. Those houses cost a fortune. You're lying. I'm not. Then prove it. Give me the address. I hesitated. This was the moment. I could say no, keep my sanctuary untouched. Or I could let them see it and finally close this chapter. I gave her the address. We're coming over, she said. Victoria and I. We'll be there in an hour. She hung up. I sat there, heart pounding, then stood and walked through my house slowly. The restored woodwork, the vintage fixtures, the office I'd built my future in. Why was I preparing to prove myself again? I gathered documents automatically: deed, mortgage papers, renovation receipts, then stopped. I didn't owe them proof. I didn't owe them access. So I put everything away. When the call started an hour later, I was sitting on my porch swing with a cup of tea, watching the light shift through the trees. Mom called, then Victoria, then both of them again. Text followed. We're outside. This is ridiculous. Winona, let us in. Is this really your house? I could picture them at the end of my driveway, staring at the Victorian they never believed I could touch. I felt calm. Finally, I sent one text to the group chat they'd created. Get off my property. 4 words. The calls stopped. The silence afterward was louder than anything they'd ever said to me. I stayed on that porch until sunset, finishing my tea, feeling years of comparison slide off my shoulders. My phone buzzed once more. It was my father. Your mother is very upset. Can you please call her? I stared at the message, then typed back. I'm not being disrespectful. I'm setting boundaries. There's a difference. He didn't respond. The next week was quiet. No surprise visits, no demands. Then Victoria texted. We need to talk. I didn't reply. She called. I let it ring. Finally, she sent a longer message accusing me of being cruel. Cruel. I almost laughed. I typed out everything. Every hurt, every comparison, every silence my father had chosen. Then I deleted it. Instead, I wrote, I'm not cruel. I'm done being treated like I don't matter. When you're ready to treat me with respect, we can talk. She read it. Didn't respond. 2 weeks later, my father called. Your mother's heartbroken, he said. Can't we just talk? Did you ever tell her to stop comparing us? I asked quietly. Silence. That's what I thought, I said. I've changed, Dad. He sighed. Yes, you have. Another month passed. I turned 27 alone by choice, eating takeout in my turret, watching movies, feeling whole. Then the email arrived. From Victoria. It was long, specific, painfully honest. She apologized, admitted jealousy, admitted her marriage was falling apart, admitted that my happiness scared her because she'd traded passion for status and ended up empty. I read it 3 times. Then my mother emailed. She apologized too, clumsily, imperfectly, but sincerely. She admitted her definitions of success were narrow, that she'd let anxiety turn into control. I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't the girl who needed quick reconciliation anymore. Eventually, I wrote back, setting conditions. Slow rebuilding. Respect. Victoria suggested coffee. I agreed. When she asked later if she could see the house, alone, I hesitated. Then I said yes. When she walked through my home days later, there was no smirk, only awe. You did this, she whispered. You really did. And for the first time in my life, it wasn't a competition. It was acknowledgement. Letting Victoria into my house felt like opening a door I'd kept locked for decades. Not because I was afraid she'd criticize it. She didn't. But because this place had become the physical proof of who I was when no one was watching. Letting her see it meant letting her see me without the armor. She walked slowly, almost reverently. Her hand brushed the banister. She paused in the doorway of the turret, eyes filling with tears she didn't bother to hide. This room, she said softly. This is you. I nodded. This is where I work, where everything started. She turned to me then, really looked at me, and something old and brittle cracked between us. I was wrong about you, she said. About everything. We sat at my kitchen table for hours. No audience, no mother, no roles to perform. She told me her marriage was unraveling, not in some dramatic explosion, but in a quiet, suffocating way. That she and Brandon had built a life that looked perfect from the outside and felt hollow on the inside. I thought if I kept winning, she admitted, staring into her coffee, I wouldn't have to ask whether I was happy. I didn't gloat. I didn't say I told you so. I understood her in a way I never had before. We weren't healed, but we were honest. And that mattered. Lunch with my mother came later, and it was harder. She cried as soon as she saw me, apologized again, told me she'd started therapy, said words I'd waited my whole life to hear, though they didn't land the way I'd imagined. "I want to see your house," she said, hopeful. "Not yet," I replied gently. Her face fell, but she didn't argue. That alone told me something had changed. Over the next few months, progress came slowly, carefully. Victoria and I met for coffee every couple of weeks. We learned how to talk without competing, how to listen without measuring. She separated from Brandon. I supported her, not as the lesser sister, but as an equal. My mother and I met once a month. She asked about my work without comparing it, complimented my choices without adding a but. It wasn't perfect. Old habits don't die quietly, but she was trying. 6 months after the day she stood in my driveway demanding entry, I invited her over. She sat in her car for a long time before coming inside. When she finally stepped onto my porch, she stopped short, eyes shining. "This," she whispered, "is the most beautiful home I've ever seen." I gave her a tour. She didn't criticize. She didn't suggest changes. She just took it in. We sat in the living room with tea, light streaming through stained glass. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I made you feel like you had to prove something, like you weren't enough." Tears burned my eyes, but I didn't rush to comfort her. This apology wasn't about easing her guilt. "I should have said this years ago," she added. "I'm proud of you, Winona." Later, she asked quietly, "That day, when Victoria and I came here and you told us to get off your property, were you home?" "Yes," I said. "You could have let us in," she said. "Shown us, proved." "I didn't need to," I interrupted. "That's the difference between who I was and who I am now." She nodded slowly. "I taught you that you needed to prove yourself to us." "I know. I'm glad you unlearned it." We sat in silence, and for the first time, it felt peaceful. My relationship with my family isn't perfect now. It probably never will be. Old patterns still try to resurface when no one's paying attention. But here's what is different. My business continues to grow. I've hired more designers. I'm thinking about opening a studio space. I host clients in my home office, dinner parties in my dining room, holidays on my terms. My house is still my sanctuary, but it's no longer a secret. And sometimes, when I'm sitting on my porch in the evening, I think about that day. The day my mother laughed. The day my sister smirked. The day they thought they'd reduced me to a prediction. And the day they stood in my driveway, staring at the life they said I'd never have, calling and texting, desperate to be let inside. I think about those 4 words I sent. Get off my property. They weren't cruel. They weren't dramatic. They were a boundary. Because revenge isn't about humiliating someone who hurt you. It's about choosing yourself when you finally realize you're allowed to. My mother said I'd never own a house like my sister. My sister said I'd be broke forever. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't beg them to see me. I just built something better. Not better than them, better for me. I own this house. But more importantly, I own my life, my choices, my boundaries, my worth. And that's something no one can ever take away from me.